Hello, and welcome to Global Scalpels, a podcast dedicated to the 5 billion people worldwide who lack access to safe and affordable surgery.
I'm Rihanna.
And I'm Taylor.
And together we're Global Scalpels.
We are excited to welcome another distinguished guest to our podcast today. As president and CEO of Medical Bridges, our guest today has helped thousands of people around the world through connecting them in low-resource countries with medical devices from the United States. Just in the last 12 months, they have supplied over 100 tons of medical equipment and supplies to over 17 countries. They have also opened their own hospital centers for infants. He has served as the CEO of multiple organizations and is an expert in taking struggling companies and turning them around. In fact, he has served as the president and CEO of Houston Technology Center, which is also called HTC, and named by Forbes as one of the 12 business incubators changing the world. HTC companies have created nearly 6,000 jobs and received $3.5 billion in funding and financial transactions. He is also one of the 7 founding members of the Texas Emerging Technology Fund Committee and is the recipient of the prestigious NASA Silver Achievement Medal for leadership in growing the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the JCS area. So with that impressive resume, we'd like to welcome Walter Ulrich today.
Well, Taylor, thanks so much for the generous introduction.
We're very, very thankful for you to be here with us today. It's truly a pleasure. As noted in your bio, you've had quite the journey from the technology space to developing even the first commercially successful email service at Timeshare, and then even working with NASA. So you've done quite the spread. And growing the entrepreneurship and ecosystem there. So could you kind of tell us, from email to entrepreneurship to NASA, how did you find yourself in global surgery?
It is one of the unexpected joys of my life. I had a wonderful career involved with technology, business, entrepreneurship, and management consulting, and was kind of moving into what I thought might be a semi-retirement, and I got a call. And it was a calling. My mother was a World War II nurse in combat in Europe, and my wife is a well-known nurse, and in fact, she is an authority on Florence Nightingale, who just celebrated her 200th birthday. And when I got the call about Medical Bridges, understood what they did for the world and how important they were, and that they needed some help. It was a privilege I could not turn down, a chance to follow in the footsteps of my mom and my amazing wife and do something for health and surgery in the world.
That's fantastic. And it's great to hear that it's a little bit of serendipity and a lot of experience that's led you to where you are today. For our listeners who haven't had the opportunity to hear about Medical Bridges before, would you be able to tell us a bit more about your organization?
Sure, Rihanna. Medical Bridges is a 23-year-old organization founded by physicians and healthcare workers because they went on a mission trip to a developing country. And when they arrived to do surgery, there were no gloves. So they took the bags from the bread to use as gloves to do their surgery. And when they returned to the States, they put a box in the operating room, and for medical equipment and surgical supplies that weren't used in the operation and might have been discarded, they threw in a box, and they started just UPSing a box at a time to where the need was the greatest. Over the 23 years, Medical Bridges has grown to doing typically 40 to 45 40-foot maritime shipping containers a year of medical supplies. Since the founding, 87 countries have been served with medical and equipment supplies. As Taylor said in the introduction, we've done over 100 tons in the last 12 months, serving, again, 17 countries. So we're helping medical professionals, doctors, surgeons, nurses, and healthcare workers get the material they need to be successful around the world.
That's great. And it sounds like you've gone from just one box at a time to a whole shipping container and tons of this stuff. How did you manage to scale this organization?
Well, I don't get credit for that. I've been with the organization for about a year and a half. But when you think about 23 years of experience, uh, I'm sure those initial boxes that were sent with wonderful intentions and actually made a small difference. But one of the tricky things about helping developing countries is to do it a way where you're doing more good than you're doing harm. And it's learning to understand what's really needed, to respect the people in those countries, to understand the expertise that the healthcare workers have, and to respond to that. And in learning those things, then Medical Bridges was able to tell its story. And fortunately, here in Houston, Texas, we have the largest medical center in the world with 54 member institutions and organizations that do an astronomical number of surgeries and patient visits, dental visits, you name it. And they're constantly upgrading their equipment. You know, those of us in the first world often have the advantage of going to hospitals where every 3 or 4 years they improve their equipment. Memorial Hermann, Methodist, MD Anderson would never have a 2015 anything in 2020. So what happens with that material? Often it gets thrown away, goes into a landfill. Instead, at Medical Bridges, we pick it up, we diagnose it, check it, clean it, make sure it's in good shape. If it's a supply, that it won't expire for at least a year. And then we package it and send it to where it's most needed in the world.
That's beautiful. I mean, so can you give us a little bit of background? So you're telling me that you package all these things and you bring it all in, which is fantastic. But what does the normal supply chain look like? Where do these different machines typically go to if they're not being recycled by you guys?
Sadly, a lot of it would actually go into landfills, and there is not. There is some surplus market in the U.S. for smaller hospitals and hospitals that are struggling. But usually the cost for a major institution to store it, to sell it into surplus, to get it delivered is more expensive than it's worth. And, we have places we serve where a glove is a luxury, where patients are served, that the physicians and the surgeons use a pair of gloves on a diagnosis, an operation, or a procedure, and then they wash the gloves and maybe swab them with alcohol or put them in the sun to disinfect them and use them again and again and again until they're no longer usable. When I got here a year and a half ago, the first shipment that we sent out had 30,000 gloves, which meant that 15,000 people got a diagnosis, a procedure, or an operation with a fresh, clean pair of gloves, avoiding all of the downsides and risks of reusing gloves. What a blessing to be able to do what we do at Medical Bridges.
Indeed, it absolutely sounds like it. With these machines, I think one thing that people probably do wonder is what are the ethical issues about reservicing these old machines and sending them out there? And how have you guys addressed those?
Medical Bridges is accredited by the Med Surplus Alliance, the only organization of its kind in Texas or any of the surrounding states, because of our very high ethical requirements. So our standard, we have on staff a biomedical technician. So even if we get an ultrasound machine or an endoscope or whatever the machine is, we even get anesthesia machines and dialysis machines. Our biomedical technician runs all the diagnostics on that machine to make sure it works before we send it out. We recently had 21 good, high-quality, modern dialysis machines donated to us, but by running the diagnosis, we found that 17 of them worked fine, but 4 of them did not. Can you imagine sending a dialysis machine to a country, perhaps like a Gambia, where there is not a single dialysis machine in the country? Having that dialysis machine delivered, people lined up, and it doesn't work? That's harmful, it's dangerous, and it's disrespectful. So having that technician do that analysis is critical to doing our mission with ethics.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so you're doing these diagnostics and everything, and so that prepares them so that you're only sending high quality equipment that's going to function once it gets there, as you said. And then how do you continue to ensure the viability of the machines after you've given them to them? Is there some sort of educational component, or how do you create this a sustainable venture that goes past just the donation?
Taylor, that is the golden question facing everybody who's trying to make sure that what we do as a nonprofit is sustainable. Fortunately, in most cases, we work with NGOs that are in country. We might work with Futura or Helping Hands for Relief and Development. And they are the ones that have long-term relationships in country, not just doing medical and surgical, but doing education, doing water, doing clothing and things. So in many cases, we rely on them. There are other nonprofits like Engineering World Health that sends out technicians to do that. Thankfully, with the availability of communications and computers, we're exploring ways in which we can provide much longer term support to the places we serve. It's a complex question and not fully solved by anybody.
I agree. It does sound incredibly difficult. And it's great to hear that you're not working in silos, but actually as part of the greater surgical ecosystem that exists within these countries. Further along the line, once these machines that you send to low and middle income countries become no longer usable, do you help with the disposal of the medical waste when servicing no longer becomes an option?
We're not funded to the extent at this time to be able to do that. The furthest we've gone with sustainability is to encourage those NGOs and ministries we work with serving those countries, that it not be just a one-time delivery of a 40-foot or two 40-foot containers, that we consistently, rather than doing everything at once, do a modest amount and then every 6 months continue to resupply, and that will help. I think the long-term objective of anybody who does what we do is to actually be sure that the NGO we're partnering with is skilled in doing that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about so many different things, right? We're talking about the logistical side of basically getting all of these machines from US hospitals and reservicing them and using the technicians there, then getting them in containers, getting them to another place, working with local governments, working to, avoid bribes, all these things. And then once they're there, to maintain them. So this life process of one of these machines is quite lengthy, and it takes an army to really keep it going and keeping it going together.
One particular aspect I wanted to ask about a bit closer with regards to how you work with these customers who are always right is, how do you determine who needs what? So how does the right equipment go to the right place?
Very good question. We generally start working with either an NGO in country. And again, one example I've used is Helping Hands for Relief and Development. There's another NGO we work with in Haiti, and the woman who leads that NGO is a nurse, originally a Haitian, a nurse educated in the United States and still nursing successfully. And she's intimately familiar what's needed in Pioneer, Haiti, the rural community where this hospital has been built. And so we work very closely with her. She works closely with the healthcare workers on the ground. She travels over there. That hospital opened on December 15th this past year. The morning it opened, 300 people were lined up for medical care, some for the first time ever. By January 24th, the first baby was born in the birthing bed that Medical Bridges provided, along with everything else in that hospital. Now there's 25 babies that have been born in that hospital. My colleague has a picture of every one of them. I have a picture on my cell phone of the very first baby that was born, and I show that picture to more people than I do of my own grandson.
I mean, it's such a pleasure to be able to be working with these people, as you said, and hopefully giving, as you said, culturally appropriate care, working with the locals to really bolster the systems that they already have in place, right? I know that in my time abroad working, they are definitely more skilled than I am in what they're doing, working in this environment every day, and they truly know what they need, and how to get things done. But being able to supplement and give some of the technology to them is definitely satisfying, and it seems that you guys have really done a lot. I'd just like to circle back a little bit to some of those business principles you talked about. Could you just talk about maybe a little bit about supply chain management and how obviously this system had started as just a very simple, let's throw some of the waste into a box, or not waste, but like extra into a box that we could send off. And that's grown over the last 20 years to be 100 tons. So can you talk to us a little bit about the growth process, and over the last year and a half, what components you've played with in maybe the supply chain itself?
Sure, that's a great question, Taylor. And you know, I believe that every nonprofit and every NGO needs to advance its mission and have that as its heart, but has to use business principles as its head. And those two things have to work together. Just being a caring, good-intentioned, good-willed organization is not enough for any nonprofit. You've got to have both sides. So in terms of the business principles with regard to our logistics, a key thing is maintaining excellent relationships with hospitals, and then making sure that our pickup program, and we have a box truck that's been donated to us, making sure that when we pick it up on time, on schedule, and in this COVID-19 period, that our driver, who's a professional, wears a mask, has a badge with his picture on it, and treats the people that he's picking it from with respect. Then we have before I arrived here, they put in place a fairly sophisticated inventory management system, which I'm very grateful for. So in terms of the medical equipment, when it arrives, it gets put into our biomedical tech room, where it doesn't leave there unless it's either certified as working, or we need to find another use for it, or for spare parts. If it's a supply, it moves into an area where it moves into our supply room, where then it's sorted. Everything is barcoded. Nothing gets sent internationally that has an expiration date that's more than a year out. So everything that goes is going to go with at least a year's life when it arrives at its destination. So the computer system to manage the inventory is really important. Now, I mentioned before that occasionally shipments get delayed. We had one shipment, I believe it was going to Honduras, that was delayed long enough. That unfortunately we had to unpack it and get rid of the expired material, and then repackage it for sending.
That's absolutely fascinating. And if I were to ask, if we were to flip this around, so as it works at the moment, you're saying that you're getting donations, you are repurposing them, making sure they're usable and sending them out. If you have an organization that approaches you and says, we need this, how might you acquire that?
Generally, we do not control what's in our inventory. Our inventory generally is what's donated to us. Now, in the case of the Haiti hospital, we knew we needed a birthing bed. So we did reach out to some of the organizations, women's hospitals and stuff like that, to emphasize that was a need for us. So we will do that. Occasionally, also, we'll have a donor that will be able to get 80% of what their needs are for them. And then they'll buy something else, and we'll include that in the container if it's something we're not able to find.
Very interesting. I think these logistics are just fascinating, because I'm sure they came with some trial and error, right? It's not that the barcode system just happened overnight, or, it kind of evolved. And so working across borders, as we said, has its inherent problems. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the difficulties that you guys have faced as you've gone against this, creating this supply chain?
Sure. With regard to the cross-border routes, when I first joined Medical Bridges, I said, gee, it's going to be really easy to ship stuff to Mexico. And my colleague said, no, that's not true. We had an Eagle Scout before I got here who, as his Eagle Scout project, put together a 20-foot container of materials to ship it to Mexico. And his father had grown up in Mexico, was a U.S. citizen born in Mexico, knew the Minister of Health in Mexico, and for 18 months couldn't get a 20-foot container of donated medical supplies and surgical supplies into Mexico. They had to appeal to the president of Mexico. So the bureaucracy, I don't think it was corruption in the case of Mexico, it was bureaucracy. So Pablo, his son, when he decided to do a container, sent a 20-foot container to Guatemala instead, where the border had opened. And then Pablo went down to Guatemala and actually went to one of the hospitals, the children's hospital, where that material was being used. So one is bureaucracy. I mentioned corruption earlier. That's a big problem, and we're very careful about that. And then right now, during this COVID-19 crisis, we're preparing a shipment to Jordan, and Jordan isn't receiving anything right now because of the pandemic. So, we have to manage all of those things at the same time. Was that your question, Taylor?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, there's, as you're saying, there's political distrust or difficulties. There's even just the specific logistics of how, as you said, they sent you, I don't remember the exact number of dialysis machines, but you said 4 of them weren't working, right?
Right.
So, that's an issue as well, as people are trying to be helpful and donate things, but I'm sure a lot of it isn't things that you can necessarily use, right?
Yeah, when we pick up things, sometimes they include things that are already expired. And we can't very well to say to somebody, oh, sort everything out for us. So if it's expired and there's no use for it, then it's our job to responsibly dispose of it. And so we've gotten pretty good over 23 years of disposing of things as well. One of the issues about cross-border is in some countries there are restrictions on certain kinds of things. For example, in some countries you can't send gowns. Well, gowns are desperately needed right now. Why can't you send a gown? Well, there's a really good reason for it. They're trying to get a textile industry going in their country, and they don't want donated stuff to interfere with their ability to build an industry. So I applaud that. Yeah. But that also means if we're dealing with 87 countries, we have to understand what those 87 sets of rules are.
No, I mean, that's huge. I think oftentimes we can think we're doing good, and then sometimes create a little bit of a problem by doing the good, right?
Well, that goes back to the well-intentioned. There's another group that we know of that's not accredited by the Med Surplus Alliance. That's well-intentioned. They've been around for a long time. They sent a container rather than carefully understanding what the needs are. They will do a rough assessment in a way with people that aren't knowledgeable enough to do it very well. And then they basically put stuff in boxes and throw it in a container. And when it arrived, we saw a video. When it arrived, half of the materials had to be thrown away right away. So there's 20 pallets in a container. 10 pallets were already garbage. So we have our problems disposing of stuff. Imagine in developing countries how much more difficult it is to dispose of things responsibly. And then there were things that were mislabeled and in some ways in very disrespectful ways. Now, I congratulate them for their intention, but I'm saddened by the negative and harmful impact they've had. So this is not a situation or a business to be in for the faint of heart. You have to really study and understand the issues to do it in the best way. And Taylor and Rihanna, based on the questions you asked about sustainability, even those of us that use best practices have to continually strive to do a better job.
I agree. I mean, we're all learning and all trying to get better. And I think that it's great that you're working with them to be culturally sensitive and culturally thinking about, what impact are we having, as you said, with the gowns or things like that, and making sure that all of the equipment that is going overseas is going to be useful to them. and not create more of a burden than the help that maybe is intended, right?
Well, Taylor, the same thing is true for surgeons who go on mission trips, right?
Sure.
You know, how to be culturally sensitive there, to become part of the community rather than to parachute in and in a technically correct but perhaps not culturally correct way, to be of support to the community. And the same questions you've asked about sustainability apply. Going in and doing surgery helps somebody, but how do they get the follow-up support they need so they recover from that surgery in the right way? And what happens in 6 months when someone else has the same problem in a year from now? How, this whole issue of sustainability, we all have to work hard to be thoughtful. Do what we can today. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We need to do what we can today, but we need to continually strive to find ways to be sustainable.
Absolutely. And I do love that ethos of continuous learning from your organization. You've spoken already about how you've worked so closely with all of the 87 different countries that your organization works with. And I think that is really what it comes down to in global surgery. It's about working with others well, whether that's in supply chain, to nurses who are helping with your needs assessments, or the technicians who are helping to reservice your equipment. It must be difficult to coordinate all of these different aspects. So how have you managed to work well with so many different players and manage teamwork across all of these different disciplines?
That's a fair question for any business. Whether it's Houston, of course, has a huge energy business. Detroit has an automotive business. You look at any successful business today, we're in a global economy, so those complications are really not unusual for medical bridges. Again, just applying what you've asked about, good business principles to every step, developing an organization. One of the things I've learned personally, and I think that applies to any business, is develop a great team and then let them do their job. And if you're a leader of that team, your number one job is communications to the world and to your team. Your number two job is to help clear the obstacles out of the way from letting your team members be successful. The person who deals with our operations day to day will always know more about operations than I do. Gidget, who does our global health work and reaches out and works day in and day out with the NGOs and the ministries we work with, she's going to understand that better than I can. The best I can do for this organization is clear out the obstacles, help those people be successful, and cheer them on. And golly gee, they are doing such a great job during this pandemic. I am so lucky.
I mean, you guys are still doing fantastic with 100 tons going out last year. I mean, it's just amazing. As you said, you are trying to be culturally competent and get in there and find out what are the different things, and coordinating that across 80 plus countries is a lot. So how has it kind of come through trial and error, or how have you guys found what those nuances are between the different countries as you work through them?
I think in our medical bridges history, trial and error has been essential. An error or a mistake is a learning opportunity. It is the tuition you have to pay for your future success. Again, shipping those couple of boxes overseas, the first year, that made a small difference, but perhaps some of the material wasn't useful in the place it was sent. Perhaps it wasn't packaged in exactly the way that would be most respectful. So we're constantly learning. And in fact, you all as surgeons and physicians are constantly learning as well. The medical business is changing so rapidly. New surgical ways are coming out. I mean, the change I see is modest compared to the changes you're going to see over your careers.
Just looking at the clock, I just want to make sure we're doing okay. About how much more time do you have, and would you prefer to stop now and go on, or would you like to finish the second half, I guess?
Well, I've got about 10 minutes, so it's up to you if you want to continue now or you want to reconvene. I'm good either way.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and move to the next section and see how far we can get, and maybe we'll try and not ask so many questions. It's just so interesting. I'm getting wrapped in, and I just want to know more and more and more. So I'll try and refrain from asking so many follow-up questions.
Hey,
Yes.
the time is just flying by. I'm having a great time.
We're so glad you're here with us. It's been
I know, it's been
fantastic.
amazing. Thank you so much.
Um, Yeah, so how about we'll do the next business and entrepreneurship section of the thing that we had sent you, and then just depending on time, we can maybe reconvene, and if there's maybe just a couple questions left over, maybe if not all of us can get together, maybe just I can get on with it for a quick 5-minute phone call with you or something, and do the last couple questions or something.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So that's a lot about Medical Bridges, which I think is obviously an amazing organization that you're doing a lot to connect people in an ethical as well as sustainable manner with medical equipment around the world. And we like to just transition maybe a little bit into some of your business and entrepreneurship experience and what we can do to learn from that, because um, as we've mentioned in lots of our other podcasts, that global surgery is a team effort. It's not just the surgeon, right? When we talk about global surgery, sometimes we think of just a very surgeon-centric thing, but really it takes a whole army of bringing all the lights and all the gloves and everything that you're talking about in, as well as all the nurses and all the staff and the technicians to fix the machines and the anesthesiologist. Everyone is a part of this team. And that includes business people, right? We really need people with strong skill sets to help us to better understand how to better manage our own systems in the States as well as abroad. And so you've turned around a lot of struggling businesses and enhanced their transaction value. So can you talk about a couple of the things that it takes to really turn around a struggling business?
Sure. A couple of things I've already mentioned. One would be communications. One would be transparency. One would be integrity with stakeholders. Uh, you know, a problem doesn't get better by being hidden. Even at here at Medical Bridges, if there's an issue or a problem of this, I make sure the board becomes aware of it. They're not going to be surprised. So no surprises is key. So in a struggling business, you have problems by definition. And so the first thing you need to do is understand what those problems are and be very open about disclosing those problems to everybody who has an interest in what they are, so there's no surprises, because that builds trust. And trust becomes the currency by which then you can suggest and get support for making changes and not losing the support of the people you need to make it a success. And part of trust is transparency and openness. And the second part of it is when you understand the problems, and typically there are financial problems, something a lot of physicians and surgeons aren't very good at, is you got to be good with the numbers. I think it applies to medical situations where understanding the numbers of people you need to serve when you arrive someplace. In a business, it's what does the balance sheet look like? The next thing is decisiveness. You can't turn around a struggling business by being overly analytical and studying it to death, which is a danger of someone who's been a consultant in the past. You've got to get in there, get 80% of the information, make a decision, and act promptly, because by acting promptly, you're conserving resources you need to survive. And in acting promptly, you need to understand what the strengths are and leverage those strengths. The idea that, well, gee, we got to cut 15%, so let's cut 15% across the board, is almost a formula for failure. You might have to cut 25 or 30% in some places and increase your investment in where the strength of the organization is. And I think that's applicable to a medical situation or surgical situation as well. In fact, I think in medicine they call it triaging, right? You don't,
Yes.
right? You don't just say, okay, I'm going to give everybody a little less medicine. When everybody shows up, you triage to where you can make the best benefit. And that's a really important thing to do when you're doing a business turnaround. And the last thing is you need to empower people. Every turnaround I've done, and I've done several, have been partly because the leader has tried to micromanage the organization. And in so micromanaging the organization has had less than the most effective ways of getting things done, and that has been a detriment to the organization. So, of course, part of that is identifying the people who are not able to take initiative and either moving them out of the organization or finding new roles for them. But part of it is having people who can take initiative and get a job done and you can count on and trust. So trust works both ways. You need trust of everybody, but you need to have people you trust. And I'm absolutely sure that's true in a surgical setting. You want to trust the nurse, the anesthesiologist, that you've got to trust, or there's going to be real significant issues. So it's not much different than surgery.
Absolutely. I think you made some really transferable points there. And I like how you translated for us with triage. So using language we can understand there. I think sometimes people who work in healthcare and people who work in the management side of healthcare often don't speak the same language. So it's useful to have analogies like that. Moving on to the next question. You previously served as president and CEO of the Houston Technology Center, which was named by Forbes as one of 12 business incubators changing the world. Do you mind just explaining what occurs in an incubator?
The words incubator and accelerator cover a broad range of sins, just like the word doctor covers a whole broad range of services and physicians, right? But at the Houston Technology Center, we developed a program to educate young, entrepreneurs. We had one entrepreneur that had been the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company in his 70s. And of course, we had him as young as the middle 20s. The average age was probably late 30s and early 40s. But you take entrepreneurs who really are passionate about making a change in some important way for an industry, evaluating whether the change they're making really is helpful to the particular industry, whether that's healthcare. We had over $1 billion went into companies that were doing healthcare innovations, energy, IT, aerospace, helping them understand whether or not what they had would actually be valuable when they were successful, and then giving them some education on what it takes to be successful as an entrepreneur. And then finally putting together a program for them that might go 3 years with milestones about their progress. And a relatively small staff and a group of probably 300 volunteer business people who could then help those volunteers. So in a sense, we became a consulting and coaching organization for entrepreneurs. The results were terrific. In Houston, obviously, our goal was to try to balance the playing field or level the playing field with Silicon Valley and Route 128 in Boston and some other places around the world. And we had some real success doing that.
Sounds like you guys have had some really, really cool experiences. And yeah, I mean, it's an exciting space, right? Lots of change, lots of new opportunities, lots of innovation coming in. And that's really exciting.
One of those companies is a company called Pulmatech, which developed an inhalation of something that could provide protection in the event that there was a healthcare terrorist attack. For example, if someone did some terrible disease and you got exposed to it, you could breathe this stuff, and it showed some effect for certain kinds of things, quite effective. And right now, they're being looked at to see if they can do something around COVID-19. So this could be one of the answers to helping protect people from COVID-19 under certain circumstances.
Wow. That's so cool. Yeah, it's such an innovative and fun space to get to play in and to learn and to move ideas around. It's really exciting.
Let me add just something else, and then we can reconvene. One thing I do want to add, when Dorian happened in the Bahamas, we would not have normally served the country of the Bahamas because it's not a developing nation, right? But when Dorian came through and wiped out Abacore Island and places like that, all of a sudden there was a desperate need. And we worked with the Ministry of Health closely, and through a variety of supporters, we were able to send 4 containers of surgical and medical equipment and supplies and 2 clinics in a box. And one of our partners was the American College of Surgeons. And so we're very, very grateful for the support of the American College of Surgeons.
Great. That's awesome. It's great to hear those partnerships and see such successful endeavors coming in, especially during those really critical times, natural disasters and things where you really, really need that extra help. So
yesterday we distributed our 30,000th mask to, in fact, 1,300 of them went to the dean of the nursing school at UT Health Science Center here in Houston. She has nursing students that need to do clinical to finish their education. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, the hospitals where they would do their clinical will only admit them if they bring their own masks. They don't have enough masks as it is. So those 1,300 masks will enable nursing students to do their clinical so they can get out and join the frontline heroes serving with patients. So, I mean, what could be more gratifying than that?
That's amazing. And it's probably close to home for you because I think you said your wife is a nurse?
Actually, my wife is a nurse, and coincidentally, she is also a professor at that same nursing school.
Oh, wow. That must be great to see.
It is great. Of course, you're old when your wife is a professor.
Well, it's a good thing. It just means that you're well seasoned.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you can share with us all your great wisdom.
Well, be careful what you wish for. I did have one thought. We were talking in the last session about the relationship between business turnarounds, business management, and surgery. And I know I made the point that you can't be overly theoretical. When you're doing a business turnaround, you have to dig in, you have to make decisions. When you make a bad decision, you have to correct it. And obviously that's very linked to what happens in a surgery situation. It isn't always what you expect when you open up and you get going with the scalpel and the technology. But I think one of the elements is in a business turnaround and in surgery, you have to be decisive, right? When you're around the operating table and something happens, you have a few seconds to talk with your other colleagues, maybe the anesthesiologists, the nurses, the other people that are around it. And then you have to do something. You can't overthink it. You got to dig in. And with the business turnaround, it's exactly the same situation. You've got to look at a situation and then take action. You've got to be decisive.
I think that's a really good point. We really can't, especially in emergency situations, you can't just wait, right? I mean, of course you want to do a good job, so you are going to think clearly and critically, but I think that's where good training and good solid mind comes in, right? Where you're able to think on your feet and move forward. And I think that some of the great leaders that we know about are like that, right?
Yeah, they apply their judgment, and some of that includes their instinct when it's a close call between 2 or 3 approaches, just like it might be when something happens in surgery unexpected. Part of it is your critical thinking, your insight, the conversation with your colleagues, but there's also some instinct that you have to put to play and move forward.
And I think there's definitely paralysis by analysis, as they call it. So it's a good skill to be able to come to a decision, go back to the structures and the thoughts that you have, and just be able to go with your gut. That's
right.
I think that really relates to a lot of the analogies you were giving us last week. I think last week we had triage from you as a great business analogy.
Exactly.
Now we have this. So I think you're great at speaking to a variety of audiences in that respect, because you're very relatable, no matter which field you're coming from.
Well, thank you for saying that.
No, I really mean it. I think last week we had talked about loads of things, and it's been nice to reflect on it over the week. I think where we got to in terms of our script was we were talking about incubators, and I think you had just explained to us non-business people what exactly an incubator is, which was really helpful. I think just going on the theme of analogies here, I was wondering if we could go back specifically to incubators and maybe see if what kind of principles we can take from incubators and apply to global surgery and healthcare.
Well, I think that has two trains of thought. One are uh, when you're running an incubator, uh, it's a little bit like running a healthcare system because some of the organizations you're working with need one kind of help, and so they need to go to this kind of a hospital or that kind of a hospital. Others need other kinds of help, and some of them don't need any help at all. And so, one path of that is the similarities in thinking. In fact, and you've helped me with your questions understand this, there's nothing new under the sun, and businesses can be incredibly different from one another, but the basic principles are the same, and I think that applies to surgery. I think someone who is good at surgery, if they think about the surgical processes and look for the analogies, they can do almost anything. On the other hand, someone who's good at business can't pick up a scalpel, you know, and do a heart bypass, for example. That's probably something that's beyond my capability. uh, I think the other element, though, is incubators and accelerators can be really important in the healthcare field. I mean, my mother was a nurse, and she graduated from nursing school probably 1941 or 1942. And there wasn't much technology, and nurses were more like handmaidens for doctors, really, right? And now you look at nurses, and nurses have to be technologists, they have to be chemists, they have to be legal scholars, they have to know how to use all this kind of equipment, right? Under the guidance of a physician or a surgeon. But the amazing amount of technology that surgeons have. My mother was a combat nurse in World War II, and the tools that doctors had in World War II were pretty primitive. By the time Vietnam came along, those tools became better and more sophisticated. And now today you have um, devices where the surgeon puts their hands in a set of gloves, looks at a screen, and can do microsurgery because the robotic assist of the device enables the surgeon to make much more finer movements than could have been made without having that kind of a device. It used to be 30, 40 years ago that most of the medical innovation came from medical companies that made devices. More and more of medical innovation is now coming from entrepreneurs who get an idea and then develop it with sweat equity. They take risks. They do all the hard work. If it's a drug, they begin doing initial trials. They raise money from individuals who hope that when it's successful, that will generate wealth and a return for them. And then when it only gets to a certain point, does a medical device company or a pharmaceutical company then pick it up and invest in it? Large corporations aren't as good at moving quickly in experimental areas. They're too rigid in the way they work. But small companies can be really good at that, but they need the large companies to then pick it up at a certain point in its life so that it can go through the large clinical trials and ultimately be distributed to customers. So the amount of work accelerators and incubators in the medical space do are absolutely critical to the development of new therapies and new devices.
I definitely agree with that. I've seen a lot of really cool things at various conferences and some incubators here in Cambridge, as kind of, a tech space in Europe, seeing some really incredible things that are coming out of there. And so you've outlined a couple of ways that we can use technology in global surgery, but just curious how tech in global surgery has kind of changed in comparison from when you first started doing this over the last, little while. What are some of the interesting things that you've seen in change in tech?
I think watching the curve of investment Uh, this may be in a little more detail than you might be interested in, but there was a time not very long ago when everybody wanted to invest in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Huge amount of investment. But it turned out that so many of them uh, ended up not being successful that people have been a lot more careful recently about making those investments. Probably 25 years ago, key investors were what they call angel investors. This would be a wealthy individual who would hear an interesting story from somebody and have some knowledge in the area, and they'd write a check and kind of give them some mentoring and guidance, and then they'd write another check, and then they'd write another check. And that would get to the point where it would then be attractive to venture capital. But in healthcare, what many of those angel investors discovered that when the venture capital companies got involved, they would drive such a hard bargain that they would actually reduce the value of the investment of the angel investor. So the angel investor up front was taking the biggest risk, but getting the lowest possible return. So angel investing in healthcare has become sharply reduced, I believe, over the past 5 or 10 years than it might have been 10 years ago. Ultimately, the model for investment in healthcare probably needs to change. And I don't have a clue at what it should look like in the future. But I worry about investment will dry up over time.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I think it's especially interesting for those of us who don't know exactly the difference between what an angel investor does and also what venture capitalists do. I think these are all interesting players to get an idea of what they do in this field, because as we've said before, that in healthcare and particularly in global surgery, it really is a lot more people than we could ever imagine than just the surgeon and the theatre staff. And I think your organization has done a great job of highlighting that with all the variety of people you engage with to achieve your mission. I'd just like to ask you specifically, I know we speak about global surgery being for everyone, but what advice do you have for people like yourself, so non-surgeons, who want to get involved in global surgery?
Right now, the developing world, has such devastating health issues, and surgery is one of the ones that can really make a difference. I'm sure you've all seen the videos of things where even something that is painful but not life-threatening can dramatically impair a person's ability to have a full and healthy life, and where surgery would be routinely handled somewhere else. And then for those life-threatening things, it truly is something that can be dire. So I think, here at Medical Bridges, we get involved because we're able to provide surgical equipment and surgical supplies to developing countries. There are plenty of organizations where physicians will go on mission trips for a week or 2 weeks in different parts of the world. Well, they need people to work with them and support them and help them. So there is often opportunities for lay people to go along to be able to provide support and assistance to those kinds of things. Medical school is expensive. Just helping someone go to medical school is a way that someone can get involved. Again, for Medical Bridges, it's something that we routinely are involved and engaged in, and we feel fortunate to do so.
Well, as a medical trainee myself, I would love some support. No, I'm just kidding. No, but you're right. It can be in so many different ways of how we can go about getting support in, whether it is showing up to something, whether it's sending some masks. We can all get involved, and it really does take an army to move this forward. Our last two questions before we move into our final five is just, we wanted to thank you so much for your service in the U.S. Marine Corps and all that you've done there, and just wanted to hear maybe the largest lesson that you feel that you took from your time there?
There were three things in my life that have really made a huge difference. One, my parents were incredible, great integrity. They taught me integrity. Number two, the college I went to, Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, gave me a broad-based rather than an overly specific education. And the third one is the U.S. Marine Corps. When I went into the Marine Corps, I was a pretty smart young man, pretty good understanding of the world and theory and those kinds of things, but I wasn't very practical. And I am so grateful to the Marine Corps taught me about how to be practical. And it taught me not to make excuses, but to get something done. The Marine Corps' can-do attitude is incredible, and it still inspires me today. When there's an opportunity, a problem, or a dilemma, I always look at, okay, what are the many ways that it can be addressed? And then pick the best one and work that one. If that doesn't work, check the second best one. Just keep going. Or as Winston Churchill might have said, never give up, never, 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 never.
A very relevant quote for us in the UK here. So it sounds like you've had a lot of different things that you've done in your career. And if you had to look back, what advice would you give to yourself 10 to 20 years earlier?
I think relatively early in my career, I sweated the small stuff. I remember when I opened my first business, I would sweat expense reports, right? If you have people you trust, it doesn't matter if they spend a little more money on this expense item or that expense item in the scheme of things. That is a total distraction from what's important. So I think the advice I would have given myself looking back is don't sweat the small stuff. Take care of the big stuff.
Thank you. I think we could all remember that as an important thing that I can also work on. So now we're going to transition into our final five, which are 5 questions that we have that are devoted to the 5 billion people around the world who lack access to safe and affordable surgical care at the moment. And so the first question that we like to ask is, what is the most recent book that you've read or television show that you've watched?
Well, this is a fascinating book that I read, and it has given me a totally new perspective. I love history. I read an enormous amount of history and biography. It is John Adams Under Fire by Dan Abrams. And it is the story of John Adams defending the British soldiers in what we in the U.S. call the Boston Massacre. And I had no appreciation of what really happened in the Boston Massacre. American history is kind of based on Samuel Adams' view of of that situation in May of 1770. You can look at him as a patriot, or you can look at him as a rabble rouser. But his view is why it was called the Boston Massacre, when in reality it really was a mob riot where these poor young British soldiers had to defend themselves. And John Adams, while he was on the side, ultimately, obviously, of independence and the second president of the United States, he actually successfully defended the British soldiers. And so the view of it in American history books and the historical truth are almost 180 degrees apart. I love history.
Wow. And it just goes to show the importance of perspective. So who's telling the story? I'm sure people listening won't be able to see this, but Walter's just held up a copy of the book. So I'm sure we can send the link out for anyone who's interested in checking out more there. Our second question is, what's something not many people know about you or a unique talent?
Well, I think the key answer to that question is I'm shy. I've spoken in front of large audiences. I walk into a room and in a business situation and I talk to people. You can't have my job without being outgoing. But in my personal life, I'm likely to, I like to be with groups of just family and a couple of friends, small groups, not big groups. I'm more often the quiet one than the talkative one. I love to listen. So that would surprise many people.
It surprises me. You're such a natural orator and very, very good at talking to people. And so, but I think that's great. You're able to talk when it's necessary, but also be able to listen, which is great. Our third question is, what was your favorite toy growing up and why?
I think it was the erector set. Uh, for those for young people, I'm not sure they know what an erector set even is, but it's a lot of metal girders and screws and nuts, and you could build things with them. And I enjoyed the building of things, but I also enjoyed the designing of the things that were being built.
It's fantastic. And I guess the theme of building things is just translated to your later career. Our fourth question is, what is your favorite food and why?
I'm a chocoholic, and not sophisticated chocolate, not the best Swiss chocolate, not the best San Francisco chocolate, good old Hershey's chocolate with almonds. I could eat a 12-ounce bar in one setting.
I love chocolate too. It's so great.
Now, it also goes good with red wine, I might mention.
This is very true. And our fifth and final question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
To a certain extent, that may go back to both my father, who always encouraged us to be honest, and the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fi, always be faithful, right? Because if you're always faithful, you have no regrets.
I think those are great pieces of advice that definitely go hand in hand. So thank you for that. And I know we said that was our last question, but we do have one final question for you.
Sure.
And that is, if people do want to get in contact with you, donate or get involved from everything that you said, how can they best get in touch with yourself and Medical Bridges?
Wow, that's a wonderful question, Rihanna. Thank you so much for asking it. Medical Bridges welcomes volunteers. And so we would invite anybody who's in the greater Houston area who wants to come in and just spend half a day helping sort medical supplies for us. That would be terrific. We can also offer something in return. If there are surgeons going on mission trips from the Houston area and they want to pick up a box or two of supplies, we can provide them with gloves and some surgical instruments and stuff like that. We would ask for a tiny donation but we would be glad to provide equipment. We call it handhelds for those going on mission trips. For financial support, all nonprofits need financial support, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. The website is www.medicalbridges.org, and my email is wulrich, WULRICH, @medicalbridges.org, and I'd be glad to email and respond with anybody. Thanks so much, Taylor and Rihanna and your team, for having me on. This conversation has been joyful.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Global Scalpels. If you're interested in learning more about this topic or the speaker, visit us on the web at globalscalpels.com or any of our social media platforms. Please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, and Stitcher to hear more great content on a wide range of topics within global surgery.
If you or someone you know is doing something in global surgery you feel should be highlighted in Global Scalpels, we would love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us today and hope to see you on our next episode.